What I'm going to talk about tonight are mostly going to be focused on the AnyTone DMR radios, the 878 and the 578 mobile. There are a bunch of other radios that are similar to this. In fact, they're based mostly on the same chipset. And so they're very comparable, but sometimes other manufacturers have different terms for something. So if you have a question about something that relates to a TYT or a Baofeng, BTEC, whatever, please raise your hand, ask the question. I'm sure someone here in the room has the answer and can help out. So please don't hesitate to ask questions as we go. So with that, I'm going to dive in. The first part of this is actually the programming talk that I gave at last month's meeting. And I want to get rid of this stupid dialogue that's in my way there. I'm going to run through a few of these here real fast. We talked last time about setting up to talk to a repeater and the tone modes and how you can use repeater book and radio reference to find frequencies for repeaters. We know that we're going to be focused on the receive frequency that you're going to set on your radio. We looked at how a repeater connected and rebroadcast. And I'm going to publish these slides, by the way. I'll get them posted on the website probably by the end of the week. So here we start into DMR programming. And I'm going to revisit some of the same slides that I used last time. So as Paul just mentioned, using computer software. All of these radios have a display and a keypad on the front panel. And it is possible, if you have a PhD in astrophysics, to program channels and frequencies using nothing but your thumbs, using the menu and the front panel. But I don't recommend it. It's tedious and it's time consuming. So using the computer to do it is really much easier. That said, it's useful to know how to do it and maybe practice it once or twice, so that if you're ever in a strange location, you've traveled somewhere, and you need to set up a repeater to be able to talk to somebody, that in a pinch, you could, in 30 minutes, go through all of the menus with your thumbs and program the radio channel. So it's still a valuable skill to have, even though it's not my first choice. So the software that we use to program the radios is typically called the CPS. This is really a Motorola term for what they originally used with their commercial radios as the customer programming software. Very sexy name. So people still refer to it as the CPS, although there are some other options now for other software. And we touched on two of these at last month's meeting, if you were with us then. One of them is an open source package called CHIRP. Open source meaning it's completely free. It runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So if you needed something that was cross-platform, CHIRP may be a good option for you. There's also a commercial package available from a company called RT Systems. And they make programming software for a wide variety of radios, including the AnyTone DMR radios. But I think the AnyTone is the only DMR radio that they currently support. I haven't seen any others come out recently. So I'm going to show the RT System software later this evening as well. And there's this magic thing that people talk about called a code plug. And the code plug is really nothing more than the file which contains all of the programming parameters that you're going to load into your radio. So it's the list of frequencies, channels, zones, talk groups, all of the settings that we're going to be talking about tonight all get saved by the CPS into a file, which is what we call the code plug. So there are many organizations that publish a code plug for their repeaters that you can download from their website, and you can import that into your CPS and add all of their channels, or you can use theirs as a starting point. I think you'll find code plugs for some of the common radios on our website as well. If you look through the forum, there'll be several that have been posted. I think Doug Comer has posted code plugs for a number of radios. So those are available if you want to start with someone else's code plug as a starting point. You have to be careful though, there are a couple of parameters we're going to talk about in a few minutes, like the radio ID that needs to be changed to your radio ID. So make sure that you edit it appropriately if you import someone else's code plug. CHIRP, I just mentioned, free open source software. It's great when it works. Sometimes it doesn't. You kind of take your chances. You don't pay your money, but you take your chances, right? So some people have great experience with CHIRP. Other people find that it doesn't work reliably for them. It gets updated frequently, so even if it had a problem yesterday, it may work again tomorrow. You just never know. But that can be a great alternative if you're looking for something that's maybe more flexible than the software that came from your radio manufacturer, or if you've got other radios, including analog radios, that you want to be able to program as well. CHIRP can do those also. RT Systems, I think, makes a great product. The thing I like about RT Systems, and we'll mention this again when we demo it, it's consistent for every brand of radio, every model of radio that they produce. So if you have a Yaesu radio or a Kenwood or an ICOM, and you've used the RT System software to program those radios, the whole look and feel and interface and the process you go through with the RT System software, even for the AnyTone DMR radio, is going to look very familiar to you. It also has some nice features that it can import directly from places like Repeater Book, so that it can import sets of frequencies for repeaters for you without you having to typing everything in manually. So I think RT Systems is a great option. For the AnyTone radios, you need a programming cable, but you can use the one that comes with the radio. A lot of people through the years have been frustrated with RT Systems because they often require their own proprietary cable in order to work with their software. What they found is that most of these adapter cables that connect your radio to your computer actually have a serial controller chip embedded in the plug, and that requires a driver software. And a lot of them are used with a prolific chip, which have been counterfeited by companies overseas. And so they don't work reliably. So RT Systems got around this by selling their own cable with a chip that was reliable and consistent, and it worked appropriately for their software. They found most of the support calls that they got were actually because of cable problems. So producing their own cables got them out of that, that conundrum, which is why you had to buy the cables. For the AnyTone radios, the cable that comes with the 878 works perfectly with the RT System software. And the 578 just uses a standard USB A to micro B cable, so it doesn't require a special cable at all. All you have to do is pay 25 bucks and download the software. You don't have to wait for them to ship it to you. You don't need any other special hardware. So it's a great option if you find yourself being frustrated trying to navigate through the CPS software that came with your radio. So common tasks that we do with the programming software. We're going to take this cable and we're going to plug it into the headphone and microphone jack on the side of the radio, or use the USB cable with the mobile radio. Once we've got it plugged into the computer, we can actually read all of the channel programming that's already in the radio into the computer to load into that code plug file. So if you've got program channels already, you can preserve those, read them into the radio, and then you can save the file. And I always save the first one when it's still empty as the original file, and I call it original, so that if you ever needed to reset the radio, if your code plug got completely messed up and your radio is having errors, you can go back to one that's pristine and use that again as a starting point. So save that original programming that was in the radio when you bought it so that you can revert back to it at some point if you ever needed to. Once we've read the channel memory into the computer, we can set up additional channels. We're going to set up zones and talk groups and load a contact list that we'll talk about in a minute. Once you have all of those things set, you can then write that back out to the radio to update its programming. So this allows us to manage the channel programming that we have set up in our radio using a piece of software so it's not as tedious as trying to do it with your thumbs. One of the problems you can often have trying to do this that's frustrating, unfortunately, these programs only work on Windows, and I'm not a big Windows fan. And one of the problems I always have with Windows is it can never figure out what COM port it wants to use. So figuring out which COM port your radio is one of the challenges. I would suggest that before you plug it in, if you can, disconnect all of the other USB devices, open up the device control panel, and look at the COM ports and watch. When you plug the cable in, you'll see one pop up on the screen. You'll find COM 9 just appeared. You go, ah, that's the one, it's COM 9. Write that down somewhere so that you know which COM port it's assigned. I'll mention too, even though Intel calls this thing the universal serial bus, for some reason on Windows it's not so universal. It gets tied to a particular jack. So if you've got two USB ports on your laptop, and when you set it up, you plugged it into the first one, and the next time you use it, you plug it into the second one, it won't find it. So make sure you also keep track of which USB port you're using and be consistent so that you'll be able to predict, oh, it's the lower port, it's COM 9. And that'll save you a bunch of headaches when you're trying to use the software. Most of the drivers will get installed automatically, but look at the instructions that came with your radio. If it tells you to install a driver that you have to download before you plug the cable in, then make sure that you follow that step. Otherwise, Windows will try to pick what it thinks is the best driver software for it, which may not be the right one. So take a look in your instructions before you start plugging things in, and that'll save you some headache down the road. We just mentioned once connected, the first thing you should do is to read from the radio, save that file as a backup, give it a meaningful name. I like to put in the date and maybe the firmware version, and I tag it as original when I do this for the first time. Every time I make a change, I save it as a new file so that I can go back to the old one if I mess something up, because that happens from time to time. So I always put the date and the firmware version in the file name every time I save the file. That way, if you needed to go back to your last version, you can know immediately from the file name which one it is. So make sure that you keep track of which radio, which firmware version, what date each of those code plugs are. So once you're using the CPS, you're going to get kind of a spreadsheet or table view that will allow you to enter the information. We talked last time, you're going to enter in the receive frequency and the offset, and the software is going to figure out then what transmit frequency to use. And particularly with the DMR stuff, every manufacturer has a different name for the same feature. So you'll have to do a little translation if you've got something other than an AnyTone, a TYT or a Connect Systems or whatever you might have. It's going to have the same parameters, but they might be named something a little different. And so you have to be kind of patient as you work through it the first time until you figure out what their names are. And a lot of the radios then have either a group, or in DMR radios, we call them zones, that allow you to save sets of channels into a group that you can navigate through more easily. The AnyTone radio allows you to save 4,000 channels. So if you're trying to scroll through 4,000 channels, it's going to take you a long time. Using the zones and organizing them either by a group like RM Ham, and you put all of their repeaters in one zone, or you arrange it by location, like by county. So you know if you switch from Douglas County to Arapahoe County, you can change zones and you'll get the repeaters that you can hit from that location. Or maybe by the way you use them. So if you've got a set of talk groups that you use for tracking satellites or for chasing weather balloons, you might put those frequencies into their own zone so that you can navigate through them more easily. So we'll talk a little more about zones as we get through this. Once you've entered all your information that you want into the CPS software, then you can use its command to write back to the radio. This will save all of those settings. It'll usually cause the radio to restart. So you'll have to wait for a minute for the radio to come back up, but then scroll back through the channels and look for the ones that you just changed and make sure that it actually downloaded so that you know that you accomplished what you'd set out to do. Some other things the CPS software can do, you can change a lot of the settings. On the AnyTones, the display, everything that shows up on the display, you can change the color. So you can do the frequency in one color and the date and time in a different color and the zone in some other color. You can change all of those settings and customize them to suit your preferences using the CPS software. It allows you to download a background picture that can be used when the radio boots up. There's a set of these that come with the software download from many of the sources where you would get it from, that you can change the picture if you wish. Firmware updates is another big thing. Make sure that your radio has the current firmware. For the AnyTone handhelds, it's up to 3.02, and for the 578 mobiles, I think it's 1.18. These probably get updated about once a quarter, and so you should check periodically to see if you've got the current firmware. It may fix a problem, it may add a feature, but if you had to make a support call for the radio, the first thing they're going to ask you to do is to update the firmware. So that's a big one that you'll do with the CPS software. On the AnyTone, there are also some icons for things like the GPS indicator, if it's got a signal or if it's not got a signal. You can change those icons, or they can be updated. And there's this thing called the contact list. It's really optional, but on the DMR radios, instead of using call signs, everything is identified by this radio ID, which is like a 6 or 7 digit number. And seeing a radio ID pop up on the screen doesn't really give you much of a good indication of who you're talking to. To fix that, you can download this database that called the contact list that actually has names and call signs and locations to map from that radio ID. So you can update that, it's updated every day. You can do it monthly or quarterly or whatever fits your needs, so that when someone calls on the DMR radio, you can have it show their name or call sign instead of just the number. And we'll show that here in just a little bit as well. So those are some things that you do with the CPS. So last month we talked about programming analog radios, and we went through the basics of doing the receive frequency, either the offset and the transmit frequency. We talked about setting the CTCSS tone so that it would open the repeater. All of those basic features, those parameters, were programmed in. With DMR, we still do all of that. We still need to know the receive frequency. We need to know the offset or the transmit frequency. One thing that's interesting, the amount of bandwidth that we use for our signal, on analog, it's 25K. For digital, it's only 12.5. This is one of the reasons I think digital is going to be more popular in the future. Places like Colorado, we're already out of frequency pairs for repeaters. But if they could stagger and put repeater frequencies in between the frequencies we're using already, if everyone narrowed their bandwidth to 12.5K instead of 25, we could have twice as many repeaters. On top of that, because DMR uses the time slots, and it spends 30 milliseconds receiving and 30 milliseconds transmitting, the DMR repeater can carry on 2 completely separate conversations at the same time. So a DMR repeater is 4 times more efficient than an analog repeater in terms of the bandwidth that it uses. So I think as the bandwidth becomes more restricted, DMR repeaters are going to become more popular because you can fit more of them in. So you'll see the bandwidth is always 12.5K. Most of the radios allow you to set the power level, and what's our golden rule? Only use as much power as necessary, right? So if you're talking to a hotspot that's sitting on your desk 6 feet from you, you'll want to set your power to low, right? You don't need to run full power to get to something that is that close to you. If you're talking simplex between your car and the car behind you, you probably don't need full power. You can probably run on medium or high rather than being on turbo. But if you know you're trying to hit a repeater that's quite a ways away from you, then you can bump your power up. And remember, you can program the buttons on the side of the radio and the face of the radio with different features. One of those you can set is the power level. So you can set your power level to medium or high, but you can easily press the button to bump it up to turbo if you find you're not hitting the repeater. So don't set them all to high or to turbo right out of the gate. Adjust them as necessary when you're working with the repeater. The DMR radio is going to require you to enter a radio ID. So as I'm sure Paul talked about in last week's meeting, DMR is really a commercial radio protocol. So they didn't deal with call signs. They dealt with these ID numbers. So the key to everything in our DMR radios is the radio ID. So you have to go to a website, and I think my next slide talks about it. We'll go to the next slide in a second and talk about it. DMR, though, also has 3 additional parameters that you need to set, in addition to our standard receive and transmit frequency and power, so on. And they are the time slot, because there's 2, time slot 1 and time slot 2. It takes turns listening and transmitting. The color code, which is, for all intents and purposes, like the CTCSS code that we use on analog. It's a filter to only open the repeater intentionally when it receives the right code. And then we have to set a talk group so that the DMR radio knows who we're trying to talk to when we connect. So let's look at these in a little more detail. Your radio ID number will get assigned to you after you register on the website radioid.net. This is really a good reference because it's also where you'll go to download the contact list. One of the places, it's really the source for getting the contact list. And so there's other places you might be able to find it, but if you want to get it directly from the horse's mouth, radioid.net is the organization that creates and manages that master list. So you only need one radio ID for you as an operator. And if you've got multiple radios, like I have an HT that I carry with me, and I've got a mobile in my truck, they're both programmed with the same radio ID. You do not have to have a separate radio ID for every radio. You can only operate one of them at a time, or else things will get really confused. So as long as you're not handing your radio to a spouse or a child, another family member, to go off hiking with when you're camping, you can use the same radio ID if you're the only operator, no matter how many DMR radios you own. And even though every time you do a transmission with your DMR radio, it's going to send the radio ID, that doesn't count for the FCC. You still have to announce your call sign every 10 minutes, just like you would if you were analog. Okay? So, yes?
Is that the same for D-Star?
I have no idea. I don't have a D-Star radio.
Okay.
Anybody here do D-Star?
Same with D-Star.
Okay.
Well, they both, when you key it, they both transmit your ID, but it's
Not recognized by the FCC.
Cross-connected, yes, it's proper to pass your call sign.
Yeah. DMR or D-Star is the only one that I don't have. So let me pause for a second. Any questions on the radio ID? Does everybody have their radio ID already for their DMR radios? Most of you do, good. So that's really your first step. And you know what, I actually registered and got my radio ID a month before I got the radio. I knew I was going to need it, so I went ahead and signed up for it. And then I had the radio ID already once the radio got shipped to me. So you don't have to have the radio in hand and then wait for this. If you know you're getting a DMR radio, go ahead and register, get your radio ID underway. So the time slots. DMR radios are kind of like our cell phones. It's not really a radio, it's really a handheld computer, right? It just happens to transmit radio frequency as well. So it has abilities to do things that as humans, we can't or don't do very well. One of them is carrying on two conversations at once. So DMR has enough bandwidth in its little 12.5K slice that it can actually carry on two conversations. And it does this by dividing up the time. So it's going to listen to the analog voice sound when you're talking, and it digitizes that to turn it into a binary digital signal. But when it transmits, it's going to send it in little pulses. It sends for 30 milliseconds, and then it listens for 30 milliseconds. And then it transmits again for 30 milliseconds, and then it listens again for 30 milliseconds. Well, that other 30 milliseconds when it's listening, that's a totally other different conversation that can be going on. So by taking turns and alternating between transmitting and receiving, we can actually have two conversations with the same repeater at the same time. Different radios can. So we need to identify when we're programming our repeater connection if we're going to use time slot 1 or time slot 2. And the question is, how do you know which one it is? Well, when you look at a listing like Repeater Book, it's going to indicate whether it's TS1 or TS2, along with the color code CC, which is a number between 0 and 15, should be listed in the information about the receiver that you'll find published online. Paul was mentioning earlier about dynamically linked talk groups, and we'll talk about that some more in a moment. So with our analog repeaters, we talked about having this subaudible frequency tone that worked like a gatekeeper on the repeater that would open it up to be able to transmit. And you have to send the right tone to each repeater in order to get it to open up, which helps cut down on interference, right? Our DMR repeaters do the same kind of thing, but they've again adopted something that was originally done by commercial companies like Motorola. A lot of the old Motorola radios, it just had a knob on the top that would switch between 16 different notches. And those weren't always numbered. They were often labeled with a color dot. And so they've carried this nomenclature over for the DMR repeaters, and they refer to this as the color code. Now, you'll never see the color code listed as red, green, blue, or yellow. It's actually a number. So it's going to be a number between 0 and 15. But unlike our analog repeater where the CTCSS tone can be optional, with the DMR repeater, you've got to specify a color code. I think for most repeaters, the default is probably 1, but you will find some organizations like RM-HAM actually do use different color codes. And so you'll need to look again at the programming information that's published on the website for that repeater organization to double check what time slot you need to use and what color code they have programmed in their repeater in order to make it open up. So if you've got the wrong color code, repeater's not going to listen to you. And then talk groups. The big thing that's different about DMR is the talk groups. And this can be very confusing. So I'm going to try to kind of break it down into pieces. So the talk group is really just identifying who can receive the transmission that you're making. With an analog repeater, it's just the repeater. It hears it and it rebroadcasts it. But most of the DMR repeaters, because they're digital, they can actually be interconnected to other repeaters and hotspots and other types of devices if they're connected to the internet. So you can actually use a DMR radio to carry on a conversation with people in Europe or South America. Anywhere in the world that has an internet connection and a DMR repeater, you can connect to their repeater through a network like Brandmeister that will allow those repeaters to become linked together. So you can talk on your radio to this repeater, it connects through the internet to a repeater that's far away, and it rebroadcasts your audio to a friend that's got their radio talking to the repeater that's near them, which is really fantastic. By default, the DMR repeater is only going to be using its own radio ID as its talk group. And this is what we've done for PRA. We have our Parker local talk group, which is really our own radio ID. as Paul had mentioned, the dynamic groups are usually on time slot 1. The static groups are usually on time slot 2. So on our PRA DMR repeaters, our Parker local talk group is on time slot 2. And that's just linked with our own repeaters. But on time slot 1, we can link to our Colorado mega room, or you can connect to any of the Bradmeister talk groups that you might want to listen to. Worldwide, the USA, the Colorado chat, the US Emergency Communications Channel. There are 1,200 talk groups through the Bradmeister network. So those can be set typically on time slot 1 so that you can connect through the internet to other DMR repeaters. And I mentioned it here, but I've got another slide. As Gene's question was, disconnecting, the way that you will connect, and I'll show a few examples here in a moment. This is really hard to put in a presentation because everything you talk about assumes you've already talked about something else. It was hard to put it in some sequence that really made good sense. If I were to talk to our PRA repeater on time slot 1, and I wanted the worldwide talk group 91, and I've programmed a channel that uses the PRA DMR repeater frequency and color code on time slot 1 with talk group 91, the moment that I press the PTT and I key up to the repeater is going to link to that talk group through the internet. It's going to stay connected to that talk group so that my radio can talk to and hear the conversations taking place in that talk group until it goes idle for about 30 minutes. But if it's a busy talk group, that may never happen. You can also unlink manually by connecting as talk group 4000. So in my radio programming for each repeater, I'll often have its local talk group on time slot 2. I'll have a set of the Bradmeister talk groups on time slot 1. I'll include one we'll talk about in a moment called the Parrot that allows you to echo back so you can hear what your connection sounds like. And I've got an unlink code. So I have a talk group I call unlink that's in my CPS that I program for all of the repeaters that I use so that I can change to that channel and key up the mic. It connects as talk group 4000, which tells it to disconnect. So you can manually drop that connection if you've made a connection to another talk group.
Question?
Yes.
So the repeater is allowing my radio to get onto the internet?
Yes.
If I have my own personal hotspot, that's replacing the repeater?
Exactly.
So it basically becomes my own little repeater?
It's your own little repeater that's sitting right at your desk. Exactly. Yep. So all of the things we're talking about tonight apply equally to your hotspot because it's really a DMR repeater.
Okay.
It's just a 100 milliwatt that is the size of a deck of cards. So yes, everything we talk about with the repeater applies to your hotspot as well.
And the way that it does the two conversation thing, the two conversations are, one convo is going on TS1 and the other conversation's on TS2.
Correct.
Those can be happening at the same time.
Correct.
But you cannot have two conversations, two different talk groups on TS1 at the same time.
Correct.
Okay, I'm with it. We talked about that last week too.
Yes.
Does TS2 use the internet or is it just?
No, it can also use the internet. So, for instance, we've got linking going on between our DMR repeater that's on Mestahay, what we used to call SQUA, and the DMR repeater that we have at the water tower that's here in Parker. So we have statically linked both repeaters to that same talk group. So I can connect to the water tower that's right across the street from me, and you can be on the Mestahay repeater, and we can talk to one another. And I talk to the repeater, it goes through the internet to the other repeater, and then to your radio. Yeah. And sorry, Josh, I'm going to keep moving around just to keep you on your toes. Thanks to Josh W0EXP for recording tonight. Yes, sir.
If I was in a different part of the country and they had a similar setup, their repeater with time slot 1 and 2.
Yes.
I could get on time slot 1, say from Michigan, and look and connect to talk group 310844, and it would come up local in Parker
Correct.
on time slot 2.
Yes. So if you were traveling, your son was at home once he gets his license, you can connect to a local DMR repeater. He can be sitting at home, connected on a hotspot or connected to a repeater, and you'd be able to talk to one another. Yep. Exactly. Yes, sir.
In the area of unlinking, do you only need to unlink if you're in on an RF repeater, or do you also have to use an unlink code with your hotspot?
It's probably a good idea to unlink your hotspot as well. Otherwise, it's going to keep that connection open and it's going to continue relaying traffic to your device, and it's going to keep broadcasting it out on its little antenna, even if you're not listening to it anymore. So you'll cut down some on your own internet traffic if you unlink when you're finished. Yes, Wayne.
They're not designed to be tied to busy talk groups. So
Right.
Don't leave it connected for a long.
Yeah, it's possible it'll,
To America Link and then go to bed.
yeah, it may overheat if you run it for too long.
Working in the morning. They get warm.
So yeah, these are the two talk groups that we use for the PRA. The Colorado Mega is the one we have cross-linked with the transcoder with our Yaesu System Fusion repeater and our D-Star repeater. So in the Mega room, you can talk to any other digital radio, even if they're a different brand with a different protocol, which is really great. And then the Parker Local has connected our two DMR repeaters together. So I'm across the street from the water tower. I can hit that using my handheld from my basement. And so it's real easy for me to connect to that. So I can join a digital net from the water tower, and the rest of you can connect to Mestahay, but we all have the same conversation. And so it gives you a lot of flexibility. Zones. We talked about zones a little bit ago. A lot of the older analog radios often had a feature they referred to as banks, that you could create banks of channels. My Yaesu FT60 can have 1,000 channels, and it's got 10 banks. So you can put all of your 2 meter in one bank, you can put all of your 70 centimeter in one bank, you can put the weather channels in one bank, you can do your simplex channels in one bank, and then you can switch between them so that you're not scrolling through a list of 1,000 channels, or 4,000 channels in the case of the AnyTone. So it's really just an arbitrary grouping of channels that you can organize by their location, by the organization that runs them, by the way that you use them for any particular hobby or event or activity. It's really up to you how you set up your zones. You can have multiple zones. You can have multiple channels in a zone. You can have one channel in multiple zones, but you have to have a channel in at least one zone in order for it to show up. One of the rookie mistakes is you'll add a channel and you won't assign it to a zone. You'll write it out to your radio and you'll scroll through your list looking for it and you don't see it show up anywhere because you didn't tell it what zone it should show. So you've got to assign it to at least one zone in order for you to use it on your radio. Mine are kind of, I've done two systems, and I've got a code plug that I inherited from my emergency services group. So we've organized it two ways. One is by organization. So we've got a zone for all the Rocky Mountain ham repeaters. We have one for the Arapahoe County areas, one for Jeffco, one for Douglas. But we also have them organized by counties. So if you were in Clear Creek County, here are the 10 repeaters that you can hit. If you were in Jefferson County, here's the 15 repeaters that you can hit. And some of them are the same channels that are in multiple zones. So depending on whether it's easier for you to find, hey, I'm looking for an RM ham talk group, I'm going to go to the RM ham zone and look through what's in my list. Or I'm out in Jefferson County today at a ham convention. What repeaters can I hit from Jefferson County? So it depends on what makes more sense to you, and you can do both, like I did. So the zones are really arbitrary, but you've got to put every channel into at least one zone or it's invisible. So here's one of the illustrations like I did for the analog repeaters. So let me kind of step through this. So over here, we've got our transmitting radio. We've set it to transmit on the receive frequency for the repeater, right? And we know our receive frequency or transmit frequency, it's a -5 megahertz offset. And we know that we're using color code 1 because that's what it says on the website, right? So we looked up this information on the website or in repeater book. And so that's what we were able to program in. And then we picked a talk group, like our Parker local talk group that we wanted to use. And so that's what we've got programmed in. We know from the information we looked up on the web that this talk group is statically linked on time slot 2. So when we program the radio, we're going to put in these radio parameters. We're going to tell it time slot 2 and this talk group for Parker local using color code 1. And now when we key up our radio, we're going to hit the repeater. It's filtered, it's locked until it hears a signal with color code 1. So that's what we've programmed in the radio. When we hit it with all of the right parameters, it's going to retransmit our audio on the internet and out the antenna. So it's going to go out 2 ways from our repeater. I didn't show the internet here, but there's an internet connection to that repeater as well. And if your friend with their receive radio has programmed these parameters incorrectly as well, they're going to listen and hear the repeater come back to them, time slot 2 with the same talk group, and we're able to have a conversation, right? So what does this look like when you program it? Well, I misled you a moment ago because I said you were going to have a spreadsheet view, but in the AnyTone software, once you look at the grid and you double click on a line to make an entry, it actually gives you this form. So let's take a look at our key things here. So up at the very top that I can't reach is the name of the channel. Now, sometimes you're limited on the number of characters that you can put in for the name. It may only allow like 16 characters. So you've got to come up with a naming convention that makes sense to you that allows you to identify what that repeater and talk group are for, right? Because now we're not just talking about it's the PRA repeater, because you may have the PRA repeater with Brandmeister Worldwide, or with Colorado Chat, or with Rocky Mountain Ham Central. So you've got to kind of come up with your convention for how you're going to name your channels in a way that makes sense to you. So you'll see as we run through some examples, you'll see some abbreviations that I've used in various places. Again, all the way up at the top, our standard radio parameters, we've got our receive frequency and our transmit frequency. For channel type, we've identified that this is a digital channel. And when we do that, it's going to dim all of this analog stuff that's at the bottom. So all of my analog settings that I would use for our FM repeaters would be shown down here at the bottom, but they get turned off as soon as I've identified this as being digital. I can set my transmit power. You'll notice the bandwidth is grayed out. It's set at 12.5K and we can't change it. DMR is always 12.5K. The transmit permit, this is a tricky one. And this is one of those parameters that's called something different in everyone's CPS. This is designed to keep you from transmitting when someone else is already transmitting. But the convention, which sounds backwards, is to say you can transmit on that frequency if the other conversation is using a different color code. So that allows you to talk when the channel is open for your color code. So it sounds like that's backwards, but that's actually the setting that allows you to talk when the channel is free. We can put it into a scan list, which we're not going to talk about tonight. DMR can also do roaming. And other than mentioning that it's possible, I'm not going to talk about it much. The only place that I've ever used the roaming is with Rocky Mountain Ham. RM Ham's got a network of repeaters all across the Front Range, and they're all connected together with microwave. And it's one of the few places where roaming actually makes sense. So you can set up roaming with the RM Ham repeaters, and you could drive from Wyoming to New Mexico and stay connected to an RM ham repeater the whole way, which is pretty cool. But look at their website to figure out how to do that. I'm not going to get into it tonight. The DMR mode can either be repeater or simplex. And for this, we're setting up a repeater. So we're going to list that. And then on this side, we have a whole bunch of other parameters. There's also a few checkboxes at the top. Let's see. A lot of these are really designed for commercial. So generally, you're not ever going to use those. The only ones I've done are like the PTT prohibit. I've turned on like the weather channels. I've got the NOAA weather channels, all 7 of them programmed. There's no need for me to try transmitting on that. 1, my antenna won't work, and 2, I don't want to cause any interference. You can also do this. You'll see if you look at my list, I've programmed my radio to receive all of the FRS and GMRS channels. But I don't want to talk on the FRS channels because that would be illegal. It's not a class type approved radio. But I want to be able to listen to them in event of an emergency. So I've got them programmed, but I've marked them as PTT prohibit so that I can't accidentally transmit on those. Okay? So those checkboxes are there. So the other things that are new are going to be in this digital box. So at the very top, you'll see contact, and it's listed as PRA. So in our CPS, I said it's like a spreadsheet view. It's actually got what are essentially multiple tabs. So channels are in one tab, zones are in another tab, and contact list is in a separate tab. And so you can pre-program a contact list where you can put in the talk groups that you want to use and assign it a name. And then when you program your channel, you can just pick the name from the list instead of having to memorize all of the talk groups. So in my software, our 310.844 is listed in my contact list with the name PRA. So I can pick that one from the list. It's going to need my radio ID. There's again another tab that lists for some reason up to 256 radio IDs. Because again, it's designed for commercial applications where you might have a whole police force or a fire department or something of that nature that was sharing the same radios. For me, I only have one entry, and it also has a name and a value. So my radio ID is listed in that list of radio IDs with my call sign. And so that pops up in the list. And then these other parameters that we've talked about. Color code. I can pick between 0 and 15. 1 is by far the most common. If you don't see it listed for some reason, I would start by trying color code 1 and see if that works, because it's by far the most frequently used. The time slot is the next one down, and when you click on the arrow, it'll pop up a list that has time slot 1, time slot 2. So again, the repeater's built-in, statically linked local talk group is generally time slot 2. And if you're going to program a talk group from the Brandmeister network that you're going to dynamically link to, by convention, you're going to use time slot 1 when you're using a foreign, if you will, talk group instead of the actual repeater. So that's the convention. For this one, our PRA talk group happens to be the static talk group for that repeater, so I'm going to use time slot 2. Now, there's another parameter listed here called receive group list, and I'm going to talk about that for a second, but I'm going to take a poll first. How many of you have a DMR radio that is not an AnyTone? You have a TYT or one of those. Receive group might be necessary for you. The convention on the AnyTone is that the receive group is automatically the talk group. But on some other DMR radios, you have to explicitly tell it which talk group to listen to when you program the talk group that you're going to talk on, which kind of doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like they should always be the same. So AnyTone has taken a shortcut, and they said, if you're receiving on the same talk group that you're talking on, you don't have to put it in a receive group. So I have never set a receive group list for my software. But if you're using something other than an AnyTone, it might be necessary for you to set that receive group as well. And so it's basically just like the contact list, and you're telling your radio which talk groups should actually produce audio when a signal comes in. The AnyTone's automatic. One of the things I like about the AnyTone. As ham radio operators, are we allowed to use encryption? No, we cannot. Because these are commercial radios that are used by police departments and fire departments and other public service, they can actually enable encryption, but we can't do it with ham radio. So those are going to be left off. And down here at the bottom are a few checkboxes. Call confirmation, I think, does a beep when it connects that you can turn on or off. I generally don't use any of those things either. So most of the stuff on this side is all the same as you would find with an analog radio. And the stuff in this box for digital is what we're doing differently for DMR. Okay? And again, this is the AnyTone software. If you're a non-AnyTone user, your software probably looks a little different, and it may have different names for a couple of these options, right?
And I have to enter that 4,000 times for 4,000 channels?
Probably, but there are some shortcuts. And this is, again, part of why I really like the RT System software. So with the RT System software, you can just import the repeater information for repeaters that are listed. And RT Systems has an extremely cool feature. So if you had a dozen Brandmeister talk groups that you were interested in, 91 for worldwide, 9991 for emergency communication. You use the one for Colorado. You use the one for POTA. Whatever your interests are, you may have a dozen talk groups that you would like. The RT System software allows you to create an entry for one repeater or your hotspot, and then allows you to select all of the talk groups that you'd like programmed, and it will transform that into 14 separate channels for you, instead of you having to repeat the same information again and again and again. So RT Systems has a very nice workaround for that. So your standard list of talk groups, along with Parrot and Unlink, you can just automatically build for each repeater frequency that you put in. So that's a very handy feature to use. A lot of the CPS software, if you insert a new row, it starts by copying the information on the row above it. And so if you're going to put in a bunch of talk groups that are all for the same repeater, you can go to the line underneath and insert, and it'll copy that information from the previous one for you. So it doesn't have to be quite so tedious. And then all you have to do is change the talk group that you want from the contact list up at the top in order to create that entry.
Did I miss where the zone assignment was?
You did not, because the zone assignment is on a different screen. You don't pick the zone from this screen. You actually have to go into a zone and then add the channels. That's a great question. That's a great question. No, you did not miss it. And this is why it's often overlooked, that you'll go through and add 10 new channels and you write it out to the radio and you don't see anything different. And it's because we didn't put them into a zone. So here's another one of my illustrations. And we'll just look at this real quickly. So this is, again, our PRA DMR repeater. And we know that we've got two talk groups that are always linked to it. We've got our PRA local, but we've also got our Colorado mega. They happen to be on different time slots. So our PRA local is this one on time slot 2, but we also use time slot 1 for our Colorado mega. So there can actually be 4 radios connected to one repeater having 2 completely separate conversations at precisely the same time and using only 12.5K of bandwidth, right? Which I think is fantastic. So all of these radios have these same basic parameters set. We're all using color code 1, the same receive and transmit frequencies. What we've changed is the time slot and the talk group. So time slot 1 is our Colorado Mega, or we could dynamically link that to any of the Brandmeister groups. So if we wanted worldwide on 91, we could put in a channel program for that. When we key up, it'll reprogram, relink the repeater to use the Brandmeister network group 91, and we'll be able to hear worldwide until it goes quiet or until we unlink, right? After we unlink, it goes back to being Colorado Mega. So this, I think, is what makes DMR so fantastic, right? Half the bandwidth, twice the channels. So this really increases the density and our utilization of the scarce repeater frequency pairs that are available.
Question,
Yeah,
with the unlink, so I would have, say, 14 channels, and it's all the same repeater.
Yep.
But it's all 14 different talk groups.
correct?
And then maybe number 15 channel is the unlink. So
Exactly.
I then go ahead and change my radio to channel 15,
Yep,
and what I transmit,
you just key up.
okay,
Yep, just hit the PTT. You don't have to say anything, but it'll send that talk group to the repeater, and it'll release that link to that talk group. You've got this. You can do next month's presentation. We'll get you signed up. So what does this look like for our other channel? Yes. Oh, yes, sorry.
Hopefully I'm not gonna take you down a rabbit hole. So like, let's take the 447.3 repeater.
Okay.
And forgive me, it's Vestahay DT, am I saying that right?
Mestahay.
Vestahay.
Yeah, stutter in the middle. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, but now on that repeater, you're confined to the two talk groups, right? So in other words, I can go to the PRA talk group or the mega reflector, but for grins, I couldn't send the Parrot talk group, right?
Oh, sure. You can still do the Parrot.
Okay.
On time slot 1, because that's where we can dynamically link
That's
talk groups.
dynamic, as opposed to the 844, that's static.
Yes,
So as long as, so I can use any talk group on time slot 2 as long as it's 310.844.
yes. But you can connect to any talk group on time slot 1, and it will dynamically link.
Got it.
Correct. Yep. So this is that same screen, and everything is exactly the same, except for which two things? What have I changed to connect to Colorado Mega? Anybody? The contact and the time slot. You're exactly right. So you'll see I've got the channel named differently. This is PRA C Omega, and my contact, instead of being PRA, is now PRA C Omega. This is the name I assigned in my contact list to our other talk group, the 310759, if I remember that right. So once I put it into my contact list, I can refer to it by the name that I gave it. But then I changed to time slot 1 instead of time slot 2. Yeah,
Just want to go back for a quick thing on time slot 2.
yeah.
It's static, but I think Parrot, because it's a private call, works on time slot 2.
It might. I'll take a look when we get to my screen.
That's the only one that works.
Yeah, you could be right, Paul.
That's just the one exception.
I think that's the only exception.
Yeah.
So that was a bad question that I had.
No,
That was
it
a-
wasn't a bad question, because Parrot is something that you want to be able to use to make sure that,
Your program.
Your signal's getting there.
Parrots is that perfect talk group to
Yeah.
make sure I got everything programmed in correctly.
Yes.
we can try it here in a minute, but.
Yeah. I'll look when I show the Parrot screen too. Good question. Yeah.
Legitimate way to check your audio?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, not your audio quality.
Yes.
It will record and transmit your audio back to you. So you can say W0BDT testing PRA talk group. And you let go of the PTT, and if everything's working, you'll hear, this is W0BDT testing PRA Talk Group, come back to you on the radio. And that way you can tell that you've hit the repeater, you're on the right color code, you've got the right transmit and receive frequencies, and you can hear what your audio quality sounds like. You'll hear exactly what the repeater heard. Yeah. How are we doing on time, folks? 7:10. Okay. I'm going to try to keep pushing through this so that we can have some time for Q&A at the end. The contact list. Now, contact list can mean two different things here. Depending on what your CPS calls things, your contact list might be your list of talk groups, but it can also be that lookup table of radio IDs with names and call signs. So don't confuse the two. So we're going to have our talk group list, but we also have this ability to load an individual contact list that has radio IDs with people's names and locations. Lists, I think, the city, maybe the county and the state, right? And the country, because this is worldwide, it's global. Now, here's the challenge. One, this changes every day, because every time someone goes to radioid.net and they register and they get a new radio ID, the list gets updated. Probably doesn't matter to you on a daily basis, but probably once a quarter, you may want to update the contact list in your radio so that a new club member who just got a DMR radio for Christmas will show up in your contact list when he calls in on the net, right? The other problem is this takes up space in your radio. Now, I've had my 878 for a couple of years. I have the V1 model, and this only has enough memory in it for 200,000 contacts. 200,000, which is not enough. There are now almost 250,000 in the contact list. So I cannot store the entire contact list in this radio. So I have to find a way to filter out which contacts I want and which I don't. At one time, I would go through and say, I really don't think I'm going to talk to anybody in China or in South Africa or Brazil, and I would try removing those, which I found to be very tedious. What I do now is I said, just give me the United States. So I figure 99% of anyone I'm going to talk to on DMR is in the US. So I only load the contacts for the US into my older radio. The V2 model of both the 878 and the 578 mobile, I think allow 500,000 in the contact list. So they can take the whole list. So if you've got the newer version, you don't have to worry about that. So this is going to change on a frequent basis. You can go to radioid.net where you signed up for your radio ID. And in the navigation bar on the left side, there's going to be a listing for contact list. And you can tell it you want to download the contact list as a CSV file, a comma-separated value, just like you would do with an Excel spreadsheet. And that CSV file can be imported by the CPS and then written out to the radio. So about once a quarter is usually when I do that, and I'll make sure that my contact list is up to date. Now, if you have one of the older radios, there are a number of software packages or websites that can be used to create a custom contact list for you. In fact, radioid.net has their own. So you can actually go through their wizard on their website and tell it which contacts you want to include or exclude in order to get a smaller list. Yeah.
And somebody, whoever you're speaking to, must be on the contact list on your radio in order for you to speak to them?
No. You can still speak to them, but what you'll see on the display is only going to be their radio ID.
Oh.
It's not going to tell you that you're talking to John Smith, W0XYZ in New York, right? So if you've loaded the contact list, your radio can display that so that you can see who you're talking to. But if you haven't loaded the contact list, or if yours isn't current, you're just going to see a 7-digit number. And you're going to go, what does that mean? I can't tell who that is. So there's the contact list. I'll mention another thing about saving your code plug. Save your code plug before you import the 200,000 contacts. When it's only your channel programming, it's only about 75K. Once you've uploaded this, it's like 2.5 megs. So save a copy of your code plug without the contact list so that you're not wasting so much space. Because if you use it a year from now, you're going to replace the contact list anyway, right? Static talk group. So we've talked about this a little already. Static talk group is permanently activated on a particular time slot on the repeater that's programmed by the repeater committee guy. And so he decides when he sets up the repeater which talk group is going to be set as the default statically linked talk group on time slot 2. So that static talk group is always going to be there. And you can use something else on time slot 1, but time slot 2 generally always stays the same. Our dynamic talk groups are temporary assignments, a temporary activation on time slot 1 of our particular repeater or our own hotspot, if we have one of those at home. And it connects to that talk group through the Brandmeister network in order to relay the audio between the repeater and the rest of the world through the Brandmeister network. So again, we had our example earlier. You could be out of state and connect to a repeater in Michigan or Missouri, wherever you're at. You can connect to the Colorado talk group or the PRA talk group. Someone who's here local can connect to their local repeater with that same talk group, and you'd be able to carry on a conversation, which is really fantastic, as long as the internet's up, right? So these dynamic talk groups, again, by convention, are on time slot 1, right? So to dynamically link your talk group, you would program a channel using time slot 1. You use the frequency, the offset, the color code for the repeater or for your own hotspot if you've got one. You enter in the talk group ID that you want. To activate it, you simply press the push to talk button. And when it connects to the repeater and uses that talk group, it creates that dynamic link to the talk group, and you'll magically be connected to people worldwide, depending on which talk group you've picked. After some amount of time, 15 to 30 minutes, if the connection has gone idle, it'll automatically unlink that group. But if there's conversations going on, if it's an active talk group like worldwide, it's probably never quiet for a half hour, so it wouldn't unlink. So we can manually unlink it using talk group 4000. So let's see what this looks like. So here's our AnyTone software again. I've named this unlink PRA time slot 1, right? Because I'm using the PRA repeater, I'm going to send the unlink code using the talk group, which is on time slot 1. So this happens to be for the water tower repeater, 445.0750. So this is the other repeater we have, not the Mestahay. All of my settings here are the same. The contact I have listed as unlink, which in my group list is talk group 4000. And I've set it for time slot 1. So after I'm done listening to worldwide or US MCOM, whichever channel I might have been listening to, I can just switch to this channel. I have them all in the same zone so that I can just scroll through the list and find them easily. When I'm done, I'll key up with this unlink code, which will then drop that dynamic link. And then the repeater goes back to its normal setting. So some example talk groups. I'll mention, by the way, there's more than one network. The first folks that set up networks of DMR repeaters was actually the Motorola Amateur Radio Club, or MARC. And so there's a DMR MARC network, which was the first one that was created by the Motorola enthusiasts. But the more common one now is Brandmeister. This is worldwide, it's based in Germany, but they have set up, I think there's 1,200 or 1,400 talk groups. And so there's a talk group for each country. In the US, there's a talk group for every state. There are also talk groups for special interests like weather, emergency, various things that you'll find as talk groups. You can find the list of these on the website if you go to brandmeister.network. So some real common ones, worldwide is 91, all of North America is 93, Colorado is 3110. There's a talk group for POTA on 3181. There's a USA-wide emergency communication channel that's on 31,000. There's a Colorado chat on 31080. There's one specifically for severe weather in Colorado on 31083. And I've also listed Parrot here, and there's 2 ways we can connect to Parrot, which we'll mention in a moment. There's also, you'll see listed here, a bunch of channels they call TAC. And these tactical or talk around channels are virtual talk groups that allow conversations to continue after you've made contact with someone. So you may start out on the Colorado group, and you may call and see if anyone's listening, and you may find someone who's in Grand Junction that wants to talk with you. But instead of tying up the Colorado talk group, you could say, hey, let's move to TAC 313. And so you'll both change channels. You'll go to one of these TAC channels where you can carry on your conversation without tying up the main talk group. So you'll see if you look at my radio programming, I have all of these TAC channels programmed for most of the DMR repeaters, so that if I make a contact with someone, we can quickly move to one of these other side channels.
Question.
Yeah.
With the nature of the digital is that the antenna picks up our signal, converts it to digital, sends it to whatever talk group, and then the receiving radio uncodes it and turns it back to sound.
Right.
Is this being recorded anywhere?
It's entirely possible that it could be, yes. I don't know if Brandmeister automatically records all talk groups, but they would certainly have that capability.
Site, you can actually listen to.
Yeah.
Everything's recorded.
Every
Okay.
conversation is recorded.
Yeah. That doesn't surprise me. I didn't know it existed, but
Yeah.
yeah. So yes, it can be monitored by any hotspot that's on the internet anywhere around the world, and it certainly could be recorded as well. Yep. You are still broadcasting, right, when you transmit. So here were some notes on the TAC channels. 310, 311, and 312 were bridged between Brandmeister and something called the C-Bridge network. 313 through 319 are not bridged. And so it's more common to use 313 through 319 if you're just using connected to someone on DMR. Please refrain from using them as calling channels, but for usage when calling on a talk group like 91 or 93, you move to continue your lengthy conversation on the TAC channel, right? So this allows those main talk groups to be less busy so that people can make contact. Parrot, we were just talking about. Parrot has 2 different talk group numbers, and that's because one was assigned by the MARC network and the other is assigned by Brandmeister. So DMR MARC calls Parrot 9990, but Brandmeister calls it 310997. Turns out either one will work. What I've got programmed is the 9990, and I can pair it successfully. So you may see this listed either way. This will record the audio that you transmit, and it just plays it back for you. It just echoes like a parrot would repeat back to you what you just said. So this is a great way to be able to test your connection to a repeater, see whether or not you can hit it successfully, and you can hear what your audio quality sounds like, right? So it's a great thing to use for testing. Remember to unlink when you're done. And I have an example of a Parrot channel here. I'm going to make Josh move the camera again. This again is the PRA water tower repeater. And Paul was correct. I am on time slot 2 for the Parrot. I don't have to use time slot 1 for Parrot. I can pair it on time slot 2. And in the contact, you see I've listed it as Parrot which I've used the DMR mark 9990, but you can also use the Brandmeister convention, the 310997. Either way should work. So this is a real handy way to test. Make sure that you're making a connection, that your signal's getting heard. So, not just repeaters, we can actually still do simplex with DMR radios as well. There's a few conventions. For the admit criteria, where we had listed different color code, we would generally set this to either say always or when the channel is free. The convention is to use time slot 1 and color code 1. There's a special talk group, 99, that can be used for simplex calls. Remember, with simplex, we're going to use the same transmit and receive frequency. So we're just going directly radio to radio. We're not going through a repeater. And so you can still do DMR conversations using simplex, just going between two radios. There's a standard set of frequencies that are often used for simplex that I've listed here. But you can use any free frequency like you would on the 2 meter or 70 centimeter band, right? Please don't use a frequency that's assigned to a repeater unless you know that you're far away from it, right? There's another way that you can do this. Paul mentioned earlier that there's actually 3 types of calls. We can make a private call, which is what we use with Parrot. We can make a group call, which is what we use with the talk group. There's another one called all call. And all call is mostly used for doing simplex because it basically overrides all of the other settings. So if you use all call, any radio that's on that frequency should be able to hear you. So it's a little easier for simplex. You don't have to have all of the parameters negotiated up front. Using all call will solve that for you. So here's an example of a simplex channel that's done with DMR. So 446.3000 is an available frequency that we can use in the 70 centimeter band. You'll notice receive and transmit are both using the same frequency. The offset is 0. We're still digital channel type. We're still going to use digital. It's going to encode our voice and transmit it digitally using low power and narrow bandwidth. For transmit permit, we've said always. Don't listen for color codes and other stuff because there's no repeater. We're just talking radio to radio, right? And for contact, it's using a special contact I listed that's called all call. And so I'll try to remember to show that when we do a demo here in a moment. Yeah, in this case, it doesn't matter that we've left that at repeater because we've used the same frequencies. There are a few things in the CPS that are intended to do things for you automatically. So if you set it to simplex, it would use the same frequency for both. You can put in a list of frequency offsets for different bands. So when you put in the receive frequency, it'll automatically put in the offset and the receive frequency for you, or the transmit frequency for you. So there's some shortcuts that are available in the software that you can use, but some of them you don't have to if you enter things manually. Okay, we're about at the end of our slides. Bear with me, I've got 2 more, and then we'll show some software. 2 other groups that I wanted to mention. One of them is Rocky Mountain Ham. Rocky Mountain Ham is another ham radio club that's based here in Colorado, but they serve the entire Front Range. They are very unique in that they have a complete network of repeaters that range from New Mexico all across Colorado and up into Wyoming that are all interconnected via their own private microwave network. There's none of the connections that rely on the internet. So a lot of emergency services groups work with RM Ham because if the internet were to go down, so does the Brandmeister network. Now we can't have our repeaters linked. But RM Ham has put in microwave networks to interconnect all of their repeaters. So on the RM Ham network, you can still talk from La Junta to Grand Junction even if the internet were down, right? So very cool. This was the group that I said you can actually utilize roaming. So you can set up what's called a roaming list in a zone, and it will periodically ping each of the repeaters to see which has the best signal strength, just like our cell phones do, and it'll automatically connect to the one with the strongest signal. So you could drive from Santa Fe to Cheyenne with a roaming list and never touch your radio. And it would stay connected to the RM ham repeater with the strongest signal the whole time you were driving, which is very cool.
Is that because they're on the same frequency, or are they on different?
They are on different frequencies,
So we will-
but the roaming list will ping each of the repeaters in the roaming list, and it will silently connect you to the one with the strongest signal. So as you drive from Santa Fe into Pueblo, it'll switch repeaters. As you come up from Pueblo to Colorado Springs, it'll switch repeaters. When you come into Denver, it'll switch repeaters. When you get to Fort Collins, it'll switch repeaters. As you get closer to Cheyenne, it switches repeaters. But it's all seamless to you, just like with your cell phone. Your cell phone is talking to a tower that's only a few miles away. Every couple of miles while you're driving on I-70, you're actually switching cell phone towers. But it all happens invisibly behind the scenes. You can do that with DMR as well. So if that interests you, please check out the RM Ham website, rmham.org. They also have pre-built code plugs for lots of popular radios that might be a good code plug to start with if you're starting out from scratch. And then you can import other frequencies into it as well, but you would get all of the RM Ham network using their code plug. So they're a great organization. There's another one that I'll mention, which is also Colorado-based, that's called the SkyHub network. And this one is interesting because their goal has been to get as many repeaters of different protocols interconnected together as they can. And so they actually have nets where people check in from all across the country, which is really fascinating. So they have a website, skyhublink.com, if you'd like to check out the SkyHub network. They are pretty active. They do nets every week. And so you'll find information on their website that talks about that. Okay, so this is the RT Systems programming software for the AnyTone 878 DMR radio, which looks identical to the one for the 578. This gives us our spreadsheet view where the first column is our channel name. We have receive and transmit frequency and the offset, whether it's simplex or repeater. This happens to be all of the simplex channels I've got at the top of my list. Whether they're analog or digital, we can set the bandwidth, we can set the tone mode for our analog channels, we can set the tone or the digital mode, and then if we were to scroll over, and let me see if I'm coordinated enough to do that. We have a few more settings here for the squelch mode, that busy channel lockout. You can set a bunch of things like the tones to send. And then if we came over a bit further, we have the power level, whether it's in a scan list, this admit criteria, the different color code or always that we talked about earlier. Here we have our digital settings. So we have our color code. This will give us a pop-up list that shows 0 through 15. Our repeater slot or time slot, which is 1 or 2. The radio ID to use, and then the talk group setting. And you'll see across the bottom here, we have tabs just like your Excel spreadsheets. So here is where I have my zones. So I can have, I forget the number, 256 zones. And for each zone, I can tell it to add channels. And so I can put all of my PRA repeater channels in a zone. I can put all my RM ham channels in one zone, however I wish to organize them. I also have a tab to set up my talk groups. So I can pick the dozen or 2 dozen talk groups from Brandmeister that I'm interested in, along with our PRA talk groups. And I've set them up in a list already with names that will show in this list when I want to select them. And then I can also do the scan list and roam channels and roam zones. The radio ID list is where I've put in my radio ID using my call sign. So it'll show that as the entry for the list. And then I have some other settings for how to control the GPS, because these radios have GPSs in them to do APRS. So
Set up with the system, with the software, or you set up your own tabs?
the tabs are by default. That's part of the software. Yeah. So the RT System software is really nice because on most CPS software, when you go to connect the radio to read, you have to tell it which COM ID to use, which COM port. RT Systems figures it out for you. It knows what it's looking for, and so it automatically selects it. So you can just tell it to read or write when you want to do the communications. Up in the settings menu, and I apologize because now I can't really see what I'm doing. So here I have get data from radio or send data to radio. That'll let me do the connection. Under the settings, I also have all of my radio menu settings. So this is where I can pick the colors to use for the display. Do I want it to use the channel name or the channel frequency? Do I want it to show the radio ID or the name from the contact list? All of those kinds of settings I can control from that menu. This also has the ability to import and export. And it has these connections built in to read radio settings from radio reference, repeater book, or RFinder. It can import a standard list of frequencies for FRS, GMRS, MERS, several other systems. So it'll build that frequency list for you. The contact list, this is how I now do my contact list. It gives me a dialog through RT Systems. I don't have to go to radioid.net and download that big CSV file and then tell it to import into the radio. I can do it all in one step. I just say import my contact list. When I open it up, it says which country, and I can just pick US. And then I get just the US contacts so that it's small enough that it still fits in my old radio. I can save or save as, I can import and export. Very straightforward, easy to use, and consistent. I have this software for a Kenwood 710. Looks just like this, except it doesn't have the columns for DMR. I've got it for my FT60 Yaesu handheld. Looks just like this. I've got it for my FT991A. Looks just like this. So I love the consistency that you get with the RT System software. So you're not relearning every time you go to program a different radio. I think it's well worth the $25 to save the aggravation of trying to figure out the free software that came with your radio. So I give it a Siskel and Ebert 2 thumbs up. I can't really show you more of the AnyTone software. Let me pop down here and try to show a couple of these tabs. So here's all of my zones. Again, I have kind of a combination of by network or by location, because mine is geared toward doing emergency services work. I also have all of my talk groups listed here. So the group calls, these are all of our Brandmeister TAC groups that we talked about. These Rocky Mountain ones are from RM Ham. There's more state talk groups here from Brandmeister. So these are shared between all of your channels. So you can set up the talk groups that you want to use in this talk group list, and then you can select them by name. Group list, I don't have any set. I think that I've only got a couple of scan lists. So just like the name sounds, I can set up channels to scan, And so it'll cycle through those. I do have a set of roaming channels. Or no, I don't on this radio. On my mobile, I have the roaming set up so that I can roam the RM ham channels. I do not have that programmed here. And the roaming channels are associated with a roaming zone. And then the radio ID list just has a single entry because I only have the one radio ID. So those things you set up once and then basically just continue to use them. But you'll be able to select those entries that you've put in your talk group list every time you program a channel. Any questions?
Go back to zones.
Zones. You're testing me, aren't you? Zones.
What's A channel and B channel mean? I see you've got all the channels there, but what's the A channel and B channel columns?
Oh, the AnyTone radio actually has dual receive capability. So when this is turned on, once this comes up, and I've got a custom picture on mine, you'll see that there are two channels listed here. The top one is A, the bottom is B. So those are the default channels to select out of that zone when you've enabled that zone on the radio. So I can pick which is A and which is B, and I can hit P1 to switch between them. So every time I hit P1, it's changing the highlighting there. So I can quickly alternate between two channels.
So those are two from whatever those columns.
Those are two channels from that zone that show on the radio at the same time. Yeah. So if you hit the edit button, it gives you a dialog that will show you all of the channels you have defined, if I can get there. So this shows all of my available channels with a set of arrows that I can move the channels in and out of the zone.
You can both load them in.
So I can load them in, yes. So you can have multiple zones. The zones can have multiple channels. You can put the same channels in multiple zones, but you've got to put a channel in at least one zone or you'll never see it. So make sure that you set up a zone and add your new channel to it when you add a new repeater.
When you mentioned about reading the, let's say, the original file from the radio before it's programmed?
Yes.
Does it matter whether you do this from RT or from the one that came with it?
No, I've saved it from both.
Closing in 10 minutes.
I did
Let us
it.
know if we can be of assistance as you complete your visit.
I did it once from the AnyTone software. I then connected from the RT software and I saved that one as well, just so I've got it either way.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm paranoid. So this will list all of the channels that are in the zones if you scrolled through them. And you'll see that many of the same channels are in multiple zones. Many of the RM ham, for instance, show up in multiple places.
The settings for the
So-
background picture and the color and all that's only from the AnyTone software?
The colors you can change, the picture you might have to do from the AnyTone software. I don't think I've seen that in RT. But I use the AnyTone software as little as possible. Any other questions? You're all experts now. I hope this cleared some of the mystery. I know this is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of new terms. A lot of those terms have different names on different brands, which makes it even more confusing. There's all of this extra crap in here for encryption and man down and work alone that we don't look at because we're hams, we're not commercial. So you can ignore those other settings. Save your code plug, test it after you've updated it. Always put your channel into a zone and have fun.